Hi, everybody. It's Miss Hopkins again. Today we're going to talk about the road to the Constitutional Convention. We have been talking about the Articles of Confederation, and we've been talking about how they weren't really working as a government. They were very successful in helping us sign the Treaty of Paris, and we fought the Revolutionary War, and we were able to win that. But when it came to actually running a country, they weren't the best option. Actually, George Washington referred to the government under the Confederation as 13 sovereignties pulling against each other. And if they're pulling against each other, they're not working together very well, are they? So the country was in a depression. What's a depression, you ask? Well, that's a period of low economic activity and widespread unemployment. That means that people weren't just a little bit poor. For a significant period of time, people weren't buying things, and so that meant that the merchants and the farmers weren't able to sell them things, and they weren't able to employ people. So it's a very large problem when a country goes into depression. One of the significant groups that was affected were the farmers. And actually, the farmers and the states they were living in were facing bankruptcy. The farmers weren't able to sell any of their goods, and so they're not making any money, and they're not able to give any money to the states. The states are seizing the lands because the farmers aren't able to pay their rents, and they're using those lands to pay their war debts off. And the farmers are not very happy about that. So along comes a man named Daniel Shea, and what Daniel Shea does is he leads an uprising. They lead a march onto a Western Massachusetts courthouse, and they force it to close so that they can't actually seize any lands. The things that they are wanting from their government are for them to issue paper currency and to write a new policy that would relieve the farmers' debts. Now, the problem is that at this time they're not issuing paper currency, and so they're not going to change their mind. They've realized that what is going to happen is that the paper currency will depreciate and will cause inflation, and they don't believe in a strong central government that would help out the individual citizens, so they're not writing any policy that's going to help out the farmers. So on January 1787, Daniel Shea leads his uprising to Springfield, Massachusetts, where there was an armory, and they were going to get guns and ammunition from this armory, and the militia there shot over their heads to warn them to stop. But the uprising, the rebels, they kept marching forward, and the militia was forced to fire on them, and they ended up killing 4 of the rebels. So after that, the rebels fled into different directions, and you would consider it to be a failed uprising. But the truth of the matter is that forced people to look at what was happening, and there was very much doubt that the Confederation government could actually handle something that would happen that would overthrow the government. Like we said, it's a one-legged stool. It's very unstable, and so it wouldn't take a very much stronger uprising to just overthrow that government. So another problem that is going on at this time is slavery. At this time in the 1780s, slavery is actually legal in all of the states. In the northern states, it's not a very common practice, but it is still legal to own slaves in the northern states. So in 1774, the Quakers, who are a peace-loving, very love-driven religious sect, decide to form the first anti-slavery society. And they spend the next few years convincing the people around them in Pennsylvania that they don't need slaves, that slavery should be abolished, that it goes against nature to own another human being. And in 1780, Pennsylvania passes a law that eventually will free the slaves. Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey follow suit. And eventually, Virginia will pass a law in 1787 that encourages people to free their slaves or to embrace manumission, which is the freeing of enslaved people. Nevertheless, at this time, segregation is still common. Segregation, of course, is that the free African American people are not allowed to go to the same places as the Caucasian or white people around them. They're not allowed to attend the same churches. They're not allowed to go to the same schools. So what ends up happening is that the freed African Americans are opening their own institutions and starting their own schools and opening their own churches. Two of the people who did this were Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. They started something called the Free African Society, and they started a couple of churches. They were able to open up aid centers that would help people get back on their feet or supply things for the people in the freed African American community around them that they weren't able to get from the white community around them. And there were lots of others who did the same thing and followed suit. However, African Americans were still not allowed to vote. They were barred from many public places, and there was still a whole lot of racial tension that would go on for several years. I mean, we're still 50 years out from the beginning of the Civil War, so there's still a long road to go, but the beginnings of the freed African American movement are beginning in the United States. So something has to change with the government as it is now. And who is the person to change it? Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton said that the Constitution needed to be adequate to the exigencies or the needs of the Union. Let's talk about this handsome fellow here for a second. Alexander Hamilton was born in the Caribbean to a mother who was not married to his father. He was not a rich man by any means. His father left when he was very, very little, before he could even really be aware of him, and his mother died when he was 11. Alexander Hamilton then began working. He was running a import-export office by the time he was 14, and he realized that the way that he was going to move up in the world was his education. He educated himself constantly. He read every book that he could get his hands on. He wrote, and he did everything he could to make his mind expand. And when he was 17, the community leaders looked at him and realized that he needed to go on and do something bigger and something better. And they took up a fund and they sent him to school in New Jersey. And from there, he got a scholarship to King's College, which was eventually changed to Columbia University. And during the Revolutionary War, he found his way up to be basically General Washington's right-hand man. He was his chief staff aide. After the war, he became a lawyer in New York. He helped to form the Constitution. He became the Secretary of the Treasury. And if he hadn't been killed in a duel, he probably would have gone on to be a president. He was a really amazing person. And he said, we need to change something. And he was joined by James Madison, who was really pushing for a stronger central government. And George Washington, after Shays' Rebellion, realized that there was going to be more than what the Confederation government could handle, and they needed to make some changes. So, what happened? It was the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787, which can be described in many different readings that you can see as a hot time of year, and that just kept getting hotter as they were holed up in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, hammering out the Constitution of the United States. George Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention, and there were 55 delegates from the 13 states, including Benjamin Franklin, who at this time was over 80 years old, but still very cogent and coherent enough to just make all kinds of interesting speeches and writings that were very crucial to the Constitutional Convention process. James Madison kept detailed notes, and that might seem like a boring aspect to think about, but the truth is that what we know about the Constitutional Convention, we know because James Madison kept these detailed notes. And his fellow delegate from Virginia, Edmund Randolph, came up and surprised everyone by suggesting a radical change. He said, "Don't just revise the articles, let's do something totally different. There's no fixing this one-legged stool. We've got to build a stool from scratch that's going to be stable enough to hold us all." And what did they do? Well, you'll just have to tune in next time and find out. That's it for today, guys. Thank you.